Microsoft's Cloud Native Global Black Belt team with Kendall Roden.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. And a lot of user groups are doing online presentations, and I'm doing a ton of online speaking. If you run a .NET or Azure-related user group, I'd love to give a presentation for you. And today, our top sponsor, ClearMeasure, makes this podcast happen, and they are a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results. And so if they can help, go ahead and get in touch. And also be sure to check out the new video show, Architect Tips. And today I'm really excited to have as a guest on the show, Kendall Roden. She is a cloud native global black belt at Microsoft, and she's also a co-host of the Azure Podcast. So let's welcome her to the show.
That's awesome.
Kendall, how are you? Welcome.
Oh, I'm good. Thanks. Excited to be here. It's always fun to come on another podcast in the AKS or, Azure ecosystem. So it's always fun to be able to chat with new people and just talk about, all the great work we're doing on Azure and with customers. So just happy to be here. And also love that applause. That was awesome. I think we might need to bring that onto the Azure podcast.
Well, the studio audience is really, really excited here. So
yes, I wish. It would be nice to do a live show. That'd be kind of cool. Hopefully someday in the future, we'll be able to do something like that.
Well, I'm hoping people don't forget a year and a half ago when conferences were still going in full swing, there was always this little room, this podcast studio, and now the audience was like maybe 20 or 30 people, but still it was, it was fun. So
I know
the listeners come to learn things, and you help to run the Azure podcast. For people who may not listen to it, what types of things do you have on there, and where can people find it?
Yeah, sure. So one of my coworkers, I joined Microsoft almost 5 years ago in July, which is kind of wild to think about. Roll Tide, graduated from the University of Alabama. And the first year that I worked at Microsoft, I was in Microsoft Consulting Services with a gentleman named Sajid DeMello. And so he and a few others had started the Azure podcast really as an initiative to put out Azure related learnings for people, because at that time when they started it several years back, there really wasn't a lot of information around what is this cloud thing? How do we transition kind of our traditional on-premises mindset into something like Azure? And so they would basically demystify a set of services each episode, whether it was, okay, let's do fundamentals of Azure AD or app service. And so now we really cover, it's usually around 30 minutes long, and we'll do episodes that are around, updates and major services like API management, or maybe we'll do an episode on cloud native learnings in Azure, or kind of where we're headed. And so it's usually going to be with a product group member talking about the latest features within a particular service on Azure, or if there's a new service offering, why would we use it? When would a customer kind of consider that? And so definitely recommend checking it out. We've done over 360 episodes, I think, at this point. So a lot going on there. Yeah.
Awesome. So the Cloud Native Global team, or tell us about what team you're on, and just in the recent months, what do you spend your time thinking about?
Yeah, so the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team, I will say it is a cool team, but the title is the coolest part of the role. So a lot of times people say, oh, is it Global Black Belt as in like Six Sigma, Lean, that kind of thing? It's not really associated with that. It's really about a group of people with technical expertise. And we started out as kind of the incubations team, or more of the, hey, a new product or service is coming to fruition on Azure, and we don't have enough enough resources in the field that are educated on that or have the time to set aside for something that's more, potentially going to turn into something or might be a big Azure play in the future, or maybe not. And so how many customers are actually going to kind of be on the bleeding edge of this scenario from a cloud native perspective. And so that's what the team traditionally did. And I would say the past couple of years, we've taken on a lot of the AKS kind of 300, 400 level conversations and architecture sessions, things like that. And so a lot of the time has been spent recently, not only skilling up and working with customers around Azure Kubernetes service, but also helping scale some of the momentum to other field resources like cloud solution architects or other roles at Microsoft that might be working directly with customers. And so in the past several months, right, I would say that stream of traffic has stayed steady, but within cloud native, that obviously encompasses a lot of Azure services. So we'll get brought in maybe in conversations around integration on Azure, right? So how do we do something like what MuleSoft can do, but at an enterprise level using different Azure services? We also have a lot of incubating technology right now that we're focused on. So my team, myself and a few colleagues actually have worked a lot on Dapr. I think you recently had Mark Fussell on, so we've worked a lot with him on the Dapr 1.0 release, just kind of figuring out how do we evangelize that at a field level, but also how do we actually go in and work with customers and get feedback for where the product should go. And so it's super neat. That's the thing I love about this job is the breadth of different things I get to work on. And so, yeah, I would say those are areas of focus. Definitely also a lot of conversations around API management. So we have a lot of customers that really want to understand how to secure their APIs or even do kind of multi-cloud scenarios. And so that's been a big topic of conversation.
You guys focus on a lot. And the whole AKS realm has been something that a lot of developers have been watching. There's certain companies that say, hey, we had to use it, so we're going to have some dedicated AKS people, and we're just going to plow into it. And others, maybe they try to do some quick starts and realize that they didn't actually start too quick. And then they said, okay, I'll watch and see. So maybe you can fill us in. What is the state of AKS and just more broadly containers in Azure for developers who are kind of watching it and waiting for the right time to say, okay, now the migration is not as scary. And it's not going to take me a month just to start using it.
Yeah. So there's so much I could talk about. I mean, this alone could be an entire 5-hour conversation. And that's a really exciting thing, but also that's a really big challenge. And so from a cloud native perspective, I think customers are like, what the heck is cloud native? And our team tries to focus on, I guess, delineating between the hype and the reality of what a technology can and should do and when you should use it. Mm-hmm. Because I do think we see a lot of people running toward, like you said, Kubernetes, and maybe they don't need Kubernetes, right? We have a lot of other great PaaS offerings within Azure that can be sufficient for certain workloads. And so I think, peeling it back and saying, what are you wanting to move to microservices for? Because a lot of people say, I want to move to containers, perfect, go to microservices. And so I would say that's the conversation we have most often. But then there's obviously the whole lift and shift conversation around .NET and Windows containers. And so I'll try to demystify it a little bit in terms of, I guess, some opinions, thoughts around these things. So I will say this space is, this space isn't slowing down. So that's one thing I will say. There's a lot that I can't disclose at this point, just from an internal perspective, but this space isn't going to be one slowing down anytime soon. I would say a lot of the misconception around Kubernetes is that it's just a developer play, right? Sometimes we hear infra ops related roles kind of saying, Kubernetes, that's the cool developer related thing. But the reality is that is not the case. Kubernetes is a completely shared responsibility between operations and developers. And so as we move, even in AKS, right? At this point, we will sometimes tell customers, AKS is really, I wouldn't necessarily say IaaS plus plus, but like kind of, right? So there's a lot that isn't fully managed. And so we say it's a managed Kubernetes experience, and that's definitely true. Is it fully managed? Not necessarily, right? You still have a lot of complexity around the Kubernetes operationalization, the infrastructure setup itself. And so I want to, emphasize that that's something we tell a lot of people is that this is not just a developer play. And I think what we are doing in Azure is finding ways to ease the complexity of operationalizing the infrastructure and management day two kind of operations, but then making it where developers can really be removed from that level of responsibility for having to have intimate knowledge of Kubernetes. So like, an example I would say of this is if you ever heard of Azure Dev Spaces, are you familiar with what that was? Okay. So like created Azure Dev Spaces. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it was a way that you could basically kind of bootstrap the creation of, Docker files and Helm charts, and then essentially use that to iteratively develop in a remote AKS cluster. So it's, I have a few services running in the cluster. I have a locally containerized instance of, a particular microservice, but I'm rerouting traffic, to and from my local dev machine to that cluster where other containers are running. And we actually shifted and now have moved toward, the second iteration of that, which is called Bridge to Kubernetes, where we basically say, okay, it's very similar to Azure Dev Spaces from a remote debugging type of perspective, but the local developer doesn't need to run their application in a container. So there's no Docker files, there's no Helm charts. It's I'm running my application locally as I traditionally would debug, and then I'm calling out to these remote services that are containerized. And so I think the biggest shift we're trying to make is abstracting away Kubernetes as a hosting platform from the developer and making it easier for operationalization purposes. So things like, AKS just came out with auto upgrade. And those are ways that we're trying to kind of remove some of the, I would say, more manual or, things that required more human intervention from a Kubernetes management perspective.
Well, it seems like, am I wrong to know that right now, if a team's using Kubernetes, you pretty much have to have a person just dedicated to keeping AKS running? Is that? I
think, I do think that. I think that the reality is Kubernetes is a major investment from a people perspective. And so when customers look, like one thing I will say is some customers are like, oh, let's just move to Kubernetes. And it's like, okay, so, are your apps currently containerized? Well, no, we haven't containerized our applications. And I'm like, okay, so like, let's take a step back here. The first thing I say is, do you have automated deployments? Like, do you have a DevOps pipeline in place? Because if you're not doing infra as code, if you're not currently doing pipeline-based deployment, then like, good luck just going to Kubernetes. That's going to be a big shift because you have to start thinking about how are we going to containerize? And that's really when DevOps comes into play, right? Because the reality of containers is they really came to solve a DevOps problem. And I think sometimes we get away from that reality, right? The goal of containers, yes, portability is great, but it really was, how do we package up all these dependencies alongside the application code so we don't have this impedance mismatch when we go deploy to prod and are missing, 8 libraries or have, misversioning or whatever that might be. I will say one of the areas where I think we're going to continue to make investment is making sure we have intermediate services that are really good at hosting containers on Azure that don't necessarily, require you to go all the way to Kubernetes if you don't need Kubernetes, right? If you don't need the scale, if you don't need the portability cross cloud, if you don't have the hybrid scenario, how can we make running containers and app service a great experience, right? So continuing to enhance the multi-container story there. ACI, great, good integration with the Docker command line, being able to kind of spin up more ephemeral containers. But I think we'll also see some progress there in terms of kind of helping bridge some of the gap between where you go with ACI and AKS. But there's a lot of really exciting stuff coming around. How do we make Kubernetes kind of the underlying hosting platform, regardless of any others, anything else, and then find ways to abstract on top? Like that's where I think the entire industry is going. And I think that's where Azure is going too. Awesome.
Now, API management, you mentioned, that's continuing to grow, and not just the microservices, but an application just needing a way to get data from another application and not share a connection string to a database or some other thing. Okay, we need to call it. Oh, well, now how do I make sure that only that application can call it? And what's it doing?
Yep.
What things are just fall into place with API management now that people can count on? And then what things maybe coming this year?
Yeah. So with API management, we see a lot of customers who are now doing, hey, I'm running multiple applications and workloads on multiple cloud providers. So like one of the big things that's come out, within the past several months is kind of this concept of a self-hosted gateway. And so what that allows you to do is basically have this API estate, right, across cloud providers. And you can take a containerized self-hosted API gateway that will still tie back up to your, I would say, API management hosted in Azure, and basically front end those, various APIs sitting, whether they're, on premises, whether they're in GCP, you can just deploy this containerized self-hosted gateway, and it'll basically reconcile with the other components that are in Azure. And so that helps with localization. So you're not doing the jump to API management from cloud to cloud. Every time somebody wants to hit an API, they don't have to go to Azure. Then Azure goes to GCP, something like that. And so I would say the self-hosted gateway is definitely a really cool feature that's coming together. Just like how do we make, and I think that goes with Azure Arc too. Like how do we make Azure a single pane of glass for your estate, regardless of if you're using multiple clouds or if you're kind of going with a hybrid strategy. API management is also really powerful from like a job validation perspective. So we have a lot of customers who maybe aren't doing modern kind of tokenization or want to kind of do that kind of validation, and they don't want to rewrite their application. So you can actually use policies within API management to do some of that rewriting for you. It's also cool from the policy perspective, right? Being able to do things like throttling and making sure that you're rate limiting your APIs. You can import a lot of other Azure services directly into API management. So if you're using Azure Functions, if you're using Logic apps, you can actually import those directly into API management. So I just think seeing that as a secure front end, right, the API gateway pattern, making sure that you're really abstracting away your backend services. And a big portion of customers who are interested as well are customers who maybe traditionally didn't have APIs exposed. And now customers are like, hey, we need you to start exposing some APIs so we can get access to some of this data that maybe traditionally we had to, get a zip file from you or download or export in some way. Like, how can we just hit an endpoint and consume that? And so we see a lot of customers coming to us asking us like, hey, how can we do this? I will say from a DevOps perspective, that's another challenge, right? Like, how do we actually manage API management from a DevOps perspective? And so we walk customers through a lot this concept of the API management DevOps toolkit. And so it was something that was created internally to essentially help customers think through the framework of how do we allow developers to kind of iterate, create APIs through an API management instance. We did a complete rewrite of the dev portal part of API management. So that's going to be, essentially where all of your APIs are cataloged. Developers can come in, leverage them for external applications, internal applications, whatever the use case might be. And so we did a rewrite of that, which I think is great and something that you should check out if you haven't already. But it kind of walks through how do we use kind of a developer instance and then essentially have almost a process for translating an open API spec into an ARM template that we can then, check in to then promote, from one, the developer instance, for example, to your production API management instance. And so I definitely recommend checking that out, just if that's something of interest, figuring out how can I do DevOps well on Azure with API management.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because that's a really common thing, and let's just dig into what I think is a really common example. Someone that has a handful of processes and they've just deployed them to app service, and they have some web services where one of their processes calls another one of their processes. They may be thinking, why do I need API management? Mm-hmm. When would you say, you know what, you don't need it here, but as soon as you do fill in the blank, that's when you'll get some benefit from adding? Is it just when you add public APIs for outside customers, or what are the other trigger points where they really should look at this?
No, that's a great question. And we had a conversation with a customer recently about this. So, one thing I will say, like one of the common pitfalls of moving to like more microservices based architecture, or even just having multiple containerized or non-containerized applications calling one another, is that concept of like HTTP chaining, right? So like if I make a change here and that propagates, I make a change to this application, 3 calls down the pipeline, or if I have a failure. And so from that perspective, I think, you want to decouple your APIs as much as possible. I think if you have, let's say, an API management instance that is more of that like public front end, that's what we see a lot, right? I have a API management instance that maybe I have a developer, because I would say some customers use it from a development perspective, like they'll actually use the dev portal, and others are like, we don't want that feature. So usually when they're doing like publicly facing, hey, we just want to put out some APIs for customers consume, they don't necessarily want to use API management as like a development interface. They just want to use it to surface it up and be an API gateway, an abstraction layer in front of the client caller. And so I think that is a really common pattern. But I think it's also really relevant when, like you mentioned, I think if you have let's say an API gateway sitting in front, and then you have a single instance of an API, and that API needs to call 3 other APIs, right? Typically, you might have something like the orchestrator pattern, where you then go out and call each of those, aggregate the return, and bring it back to the initial API. There are multiple, patterns for how to accomplish that. But I think once you want to modularize the functionality for use in other things, that's a consideration. So let's say I have an API front-ended by API gateway and a second API that's going to be called into internally. That can be fine. Maybe you don't need API gateway between those 2 services, but when the calls become excessive, right? When you start getting high scalability, when you have hundreds of callers to that second API, that would be a use case, right? Maybe also you want the functionality in API 2, let's say in this case, API 1, API 2, that functionality in API 2 isn't only going to be called by API 1, right? It's going to have other consumers that might call it directly. So I think those are times when we see customers kind of debating, do I have 2 API management instances? Can I use the same API management instance to basically do a call through? And some of that has to do with auth as well, right? Do you want to do kind of an on behalf of flow from the initial API to multiple internal APIs? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of considerations, but I would say it's totally normal to have 2 APIs that are front-ended by the same API gateway that can call one another. And it's also normal to have kind of more public-facing, internal-facing. And you can specify, right, is it an internal API or an external API within API gateway?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
As time progresses, you're going to gain more web service APIs, and another one's going to come online, and then another one. And so for provisioning, as we always talk about on this podcast, regardless of what we're developing and deploying, it's like, okay, how do we deploy that? How do we change it? Is it a safe assumption that the ARM template is the way to provision these services as well, just like everything else?
So I think the biggest thing is kind of thinking through what are you currently doing today from like an infrastructure as code perspective. So like ARM templates, Terraform, all of that's an acceptable pattern. I think in general, what we see, depending on your Azure DevOps pipeline, right? Within the DevOps toolkit, kind of the approach is, okay, we have kind of a master ARM template that essentially is going to call out to sub templates that kind of specify certain information regarding a single API. So for example, let's say I'm a developer, I've deployed I'm writing my application code, or I'm writing my API, I've deployed it to a an app service, or that's kind of the approach I'm going to take. What it'll do for you is it'll actually templatize basically the open API spec that you can generate after you've, created your API and deployed it. And that open API spec can be translated, like you mentioned, into an ARM template. And then you can basically use the master template in order to reference the new API template. And so, yeah, that's an acceptable approach, right? I think infrastructure as code is the way to go, whether it's ARM or, it's Terraform or another provider is totally up to the user. And I'm not sure, have y'all talked much on the podcast about Bicep or kind of the move toward Bicep?
We haven't yet, but yeah, it's funny. ARM templates, Bicep.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure some other things are going to come on. But infrastructure as code, that's a big topic. And I think there's still an unanswered question. I'm interested how your team handles it. You got the initial provisioning, and that seems to, there's good solutions there. But then infrastructure migrations is still an open conversation where, okay, I've provisioned it, that's great, but now because of this new feature and this new build, the infrastructure needs to change. And with API management, that would seem to be ongoing. Oh, there's a new API. Well, in order to deploy this build, there's something about the infrastructure that needs to have a configuration change. So what's the method of modifying the configuration of API management during a deployment?
So I guess from an infrastructure perspective, I'm not 100% sure because it is a managed service, right? It's a PaaS service. So you're not really going to have that much control over the infrastructure. Like, for example, API management, a lot of customers run it in like a serverless model, right? So you're not really doing any, I guess, underlying Azure infrastructure configuration. Now, if you need to change a configuration setting within your API management instance, you can still do that via the traditional ARM configuration deployments, right? So like I would still say, if you have a config change while you're also doing an API deployment, you can do that all in your ARM templates. There shouldn't be anything that's kind of outside of that. But maybe I'm not understanding the question fully, right? Maybe I'm getting on my depth there.
So if we have a new API, we just add it to the original ARM template, deploy it again. It'll say, oh, this is new. Let me add this API.
Yeah, so just incremental. Yeah, that's traditionally what I would say, right? You're just doing an incremental ARM deployment of the new API into the API management instance. And so within your, and if you check out the Azure DevOps toolkit, it kind of walks you through what that would look like. But yeah, essentially, once you have that open API spec, which is what the developer is going to be the most familiar with, when they're iterating. So you have this iterative dev portal, you're creating new APIs, you're messing around with it in that dev instance. Once you've created the open API spec, done your testing locally, and that, you've deployed it to the local API management instance, then you can auto generate the ARM template. And that ARM template will also have configuration in it, right? Configuration around the API itself, the policy that's related to it. And so you'll have almost like a master template for API management, but you'll have a master deployment template for the API itself, right? And the configuration related to that API. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the other things that you mentioned that your team works on is Dapr. And we recently had a show on Dapr on going into the development of it. Do you guys also work on the actual framework or more the infrastructure side of it?
So we work mostly on the like app development side, right? And when I say app development side, I mean, how do we help developers understand the value of Dapr? Because we've actually created some great content that we run with customers. That's all around kind of local developer experience. Because I think when it comes to things like Kubernetes, right, we're like very Kubernetes first in terms of how we sometimes talk about microservices. It's like Kubernetes is always in the picture. But with Dapr, it's really how do we help developers understand the value of what Dapr provides? Things like, the secret management, right? Being able to call out to a variety of different services, different cloud providers, but still be able to choose the language of your choice and abstract away the complexity of the hosting platform underneath. So I think Dapr has a lot of dev-centric benefits that sometimes get overlooked because we're thinking about, Kubernetes. But we've done obviously a lot of work because Dapr is, I would say, most naturally hosted at this point in things like Kubernetes. So it's cool to see how a lot of different projects come together when you start taking, Dapr and hosting it on Kubernetes. Things like, pod identity, are really, really big, because basically you can use pod identity to give, and obviously all of that happens through these YAML deployments and configuration. So we have Helm charts for a variety of microservices within the application. We do things like pod identity. We use Helm to deploy Cert Manager. And so there's a lot of cool stuff there, I would say. But yeah, I think we focus on it primarily from a developer perspective, and then help guide developers and operations to understand, okay, how do we now take what we've done locally and put it onto Kubernetes, if that makes sense.
And I want to mention, for those who missed show number 130 with Mark Fusel, you can go back and look at show number 130, and it kind of went deeper into Dapr, spelled Dapr, not to be confused with Dapr, the object relational mapper.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I would also say too, just like quick snippet here, it's a distributed application runtime that essentially, when you're thinking from like a Kubernetes perspective, you have your application code, running as a container in a pod, and then you'll run Dapr kind of using that sidecar model. So it'll run side by side in the same pod with each of your microservices, and it basically offloads some of the responsibilities that developers used to have around creating microservices. So things like distributed tracing, if you think service mesh, it has some of that capability. It can do MTLS between sidecar to sidecar. So your microservices can kind of have that.
Can you define that acronym, MTRS?
Yeah, mutual TLS. I'm not sure. I don't translation language. I don't even know what TLS stands for. Yeah, that's like born in the cloud. I know it's all about, security, right? But so yeah, it basically allows for the secure communication channel. I'm not sure what TLS actually stands for. I've never looked it up. But yeah, mutual TLS. So basically just making sure you can do secure communication. Do you know what it stands for?
So you're right. I try to be the acronym police on the podcast.
Yeah, no, it's good.
But TLS kind of replaced SSL for the encryption.
Secure socket language. I got that one.
Right. And
I'm trying to think of what the actual transport layer security. Transport layer security. Search. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it essentially just think of it as encrypted, right? Encrypted communication. And that's a lot of what, customers use like a service mesh for, is to get encrypted communication between all of their containers running within Kubernetes.
Well, this is a decent aside, if I could interject. There's so many acronyms in the industry that we sometimes use them as actual words, and then wait, what does that stand for again?
For sure.
I knew it at one point, but we never say transport level security.
We never say it out
just
loud.
Like secure socket layers. I mean, no, we just say so I would say, for anybody who is worried about not knowing an acronym, it doesn't matter. You can look it up at any time. It's fine.
Oh, there's so many things that I think that's the whole thing, is like, it's impossible to understand and fully comprehend everything within this space, right? Like, I'm still learning a lot about kind of like TLS and certificates. Like I didn't, grow up learning about technology really. And then, when I went to college and graduated, I've never really learned some about the security side of things. So like, there's still so much I'm learning. It's such a moving target, especially when there's always a new technology to learn about. Sometimes it's hard to go back and learn some of the fundamental principles. And so luckily we have, security people on the team. We have people who are really good at a lot of these things. But I guess the biggest call out is just Dapr provides a way to kind of codify best practices around microservices. So like, service to service communication, pub sub, all of that are things that traditionally you'd bring in some kind of SDK or library into your application code to talk to these various services. And so to be able to offload that to this Dapr sidecar allows you to very easily change the underlying implementation for those various, microservices pillars. Super cool stuff. Works really well in Kubernetes.
Does your team have any kind of really exciting things coming up that you're targeting for the .NET 6 release in November?
Not particularly, not on my team. If anything, I think, we work with a lot of Linux customers who are running, we'll work with customers who have moved to .NET Core, who are in that containerization stage. We're not working with people as actively like the developers that are kind of like, oh, okay, what's new in .NET 5, right? That's great. And that's a great conversation. It's just not one that we have that frequently. And so there's some really great people that we've collaborated with just in terms of, we have people on our team that focus a lot on Windows containers. If that's an area of interest, I think that space is really evolving, but we do see a lot of customers that, move towards .NET Core, .NET 5, .NET 6 in order to leverage the Linux-based container model, which I think is great and, great on Azure as well. And I think, Windows containers definitely have a place, but there's work to be done there, I would say. And it comes with its own set of challenges, the lift and shift, right?
Cool. Well, listeners can find you on Twitter at Kendall Roden with 2 L's. And is there any other resources or go-to websites that you would encourage the listeners to check out?
Yeah, for sure. So our team, the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team, we actually run a series of office hour calls. It's every other week on Thursdays at 11 CST. And so it's called the AKS Office Hours. It's totally public. And it's really great just because we talk a lot about these topics. We talk about I think we were actually planning on doing one around DevOps coming up here soon. Things like Azure Arc, like that's something I would say, I have a couple of quick call outs. Azure Arc with GitOps, right? Big thing that we've been working on and talking to customers around. So obviously using kind of your declarative model of Git being the source of truth for your Kubernetes config and your, application code. And then also we've been playing around with GitHub packages and like GitHub Container Registry. Really cool if you haven't played with those things. But yeah, come to the AKS office hours. I will make sure to drop a link there. Another thing is my teammate and I are actually running a webinar series on the first one's April 14th. And then there will be 2 consecutive weeks where we do Wednesday webinar sessions, 90 minutes. And it's going to be all about kind of configuring your cluster with confidence. And then we'll also go into things like Dapr and Kata and how to leverage those to kind of expand and help your workload to flourish on top of AKS as a hosting platform. So
Kata,
I'll make sure to send those links over.
Yes.
Yeah, Kata.
Kata, how do you spell that? That's one I hadn't heard yet.
Yeah, KEDA, Kubernetes Event-Driven Architecture. Okay. So, awesome. Essentially, just for those of you who aren't familiar, it allows your pods or your containers within Kubernetes to scale on metrics outside of what you would traditionally scale on. So, for example, like the number of messages in an Azure Service Bus or the number of messages in a queue. And so, instead of doing scale, based on CPU and memory, you can start scaling in a more event-driven way. And that's an open source project. Microsoft contributes to, but it's great. Kata with Dapr is awesome to check out. And I also have a link to a session that I did on Kata and happy to link that as well.
That's going to be brilliant because you're right. I may have 2 messages and CPU is spiked, high memory. And so what I scale up and then I finish those 2 messages and I'm done. No, yeah. I don't need to scale up if I have a backlog. So that is good.
It's super, super cool. And I think that project is just going to continue to be super, super relevant and super exciting. I will say big update yesterday from the Azure open source space, the AKS add-on for Open Service Mesh. So I know that's a bit tangential, but if you're interested in checking that out, there's now a public preview. So you can go kind of see what it would look like to have a service mesh that's basically integrated directly into your Kubernetes cluster on Azure. So that was a big update yesterday.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all the great information and for taking the time to come on the show from a fellow podcaster. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. We'll have to have you on the Azure podcast soon. So
hey, that'd be fun.
Tit for tat there. Okay, awesome.
All right. Thank you. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.